Hello, folks. Welcome to another edition of Inside the Marble Palace. I'm Murray Mandrick, political columnist for the Leader Post and the Saskatchewan Star Phoenix. Joining me, as always, Jeremy Symes, political reporter for the Regina Leader Post, and a face that we've missed, Adam Hunter, provincial affairs reporter for CBC in Saskatchewan. Hi, guys.
I'm right.
Hello.
Another fall sitting in the books. How about that? And it ended with some kind of interesting legislation. And let's get that out of the way, starting with you, Jeremy. We can now drink in the parks legally, and we can. It's been a while since I have them. That was my youth. And we are also looking at collecting our own corporate income tax, although I've never seen an issue where there was such divergence between the opposition response and the government response in terms of how much this will cost, how many people will hire. So let's start with that one, Jeremy, if you don't mind. And like, why is there this vast difference, and what is the vast difference between what we heard from Finance Minister Donna Harpower and what we heard from NDP opposition finance critic Trent Witherspoon?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. So there was new legislation introduced this week. The Saskatchewan Revenue Agency is what they are looking to create. So what this bill does is, if they do create this agency, it would administer taxes and related programs. And this mainly includes taking control of the provincial portion of the corporate income tax system that the federal government currently administers in the province. So what they would do is they would establish the agency, give its parameters on its purpose, its powers, and its structures, and then who it's going to or what it'd be accountable for and that sort of thing. Now, where the differences came, we saw was the NDP is saying this is going to be a huge cost. We don't actually know what the cost is going to be, but we had Trent Witherspoon come out and basically say this is going to cost between 15 million to 20 million annually. He doesn't believe that it's going to be revenue neutral, like Finance Minister Donna Harpower says. And he thinks, the government's going to need to hire like 100 to 150 employees to make this happen. One of his quotes that really kind of stood out was just like, but all they're doing is growing a bigger government and making things more cumbersome for business. It's backward, it costs more, it's a boneheaded exercise. So that's where the NDP stands on it. It's a very strong stance. And now going to Harpower, she says, it's revenue neutral. They wanted to implement it because the CRA is delaying some information. If you looked at their news release, they said it was also part of their autonomy plans. And yeah, she just thinks, the CRA is making some decisions that are harmful to some corporations, mostly run by women, and that the government could maybe make it easier for them. Now, the revenue neutral claim, we'll kind of see it. She didn't seem super confident that'd be revenue neutral. I know you kind of pressed her on that, Murray, and she says, well, I feel strongly it could be, but she couldn't make any kind of guarantees on that one.
Yeah. And yet, Witherspoon's talking about hiring hundreds. And just before we go to Adam, just tell me why I don't have to take my brown bag to the park anymore, which I always recycled, and I can just drink normally.
Yeah, for sure. So the provincial government introduced legislation that would essentially allow cities to decide if they will allow residents to drink in public parks. It would give cities authority to establish what these drinking areas would be. And so this kind of came after in the spring, the government tried to do this. It should come through because it came in really late and it died on the order paper. But now this time they can have more healthy debate on it. This looks like something the NDP will be supporting this time around. It was in the spring that they said they needed to do more consultation on it. From what they heard from their consultants, I guess, was that, yeah, some municipalities might not like this, but they don't have to implement it. While they also heard other municipalities do like this and do want to implement it. Saskatchewan comes to mind as the city that is really seems a bit more for this. They have a council that actually wanted to look into this specifically. In Regina, we'll see what the council does with it. I know there's been a lot of mixed reaction here. Now, for places like Wascana, it'll be a decision made by the park authority and the city. So we'll see what these cities do, but it's really up to them now.
Well, Adam, you and I have a summer project apparently. I'm curious how you think these last couple of bills fit in with the overall legislative agenda of the government this fall sitting, because it seemed pretty much to be about greater independence for Saskatchewan and maybe making a few notes to the public of a more definitive conservative direction in terms of getting out of business. Because what we also saw this session was in the throne speech was obviously the call to um, end any form of publicly owned retail liquor stores. They were down to the legislature to talk about that. Do you see those themes emerging, and do you think they'll be a successful sell for the government? How did the government kind of weave those themes into its political narrative this fall?
I think that this was all sort of set up even going back to last year's throne speech, where the government was talking about, increasing their provincial policing, you know, supplementing, what the RCMP does and the municipal police forces does. We saw that with the Marshal Service creation, with more of these policing teams. Every day this week, I think we got a release about how much money different municipalities were getting for policing from the government. So that was one thing that stands out. We talked about the Saskatchewan Revenue Agency. I think that was something else that was also mentioned previously by this government. And I think it all stems from those autonomy meetings. Carla Beck calls them separation meetings from this, summer and maybe spring, depending on when the government, wants to start that timeline. But the town halls the premier had, and when Donna Harpower talks about, this is what people want, the NDP is disagreeing with her. It can all be traced back to, I think, part of that. And this is in each of those releases, Jeremy touched on it. Even in the revenue agency, this is creating more autonomy for Saskatchewan. It's preventing from federal intrusion when we talk about the Saskatchewan First Act, which was their big, landmark first bill that they introduced. So I think a lot of this goes back to those discussions, those conversations, the speeches that Premier Moe has about protecting Saskatchewan, growing the economy, making sure that the federal government isn't getting in the way in any sense of that, and also a message from the government to go back to their supporters or the people that they're listening to say, hey, you wanted us to push for more autonomy from Ottawa, more independence. This is how we're doing it. It's through this tax collection. It's through creating more police. It's getting the Marshal Service into rural Saskatchewan. The question is whether this is something that Saskatchewan people really want or need. And the opposition made the point that these aren't priorities for people in Saskatchewan. We don't need a Marshal Service. We heard a lot of pushback on that from policing groups, police unions, who said this is a duplication. This is going to lead to confusion. It's not necessary. Just give more money to the police if you think that you need more policing for more officers. And so I think that was the push pull of this last little while. We also had the $500 checks, which finally are in the mail. And it was interesting. Carla Beck even mentioned to one of her answers in her last scrum was, I think people like these $500 checks. She can't really say that they're bad. That's something that NDP was asking for going back to the spring. They obviously think there more should be done, that there's not enough support given to people with cost of living and affordability issues. But she even said, this was something that she couldn't really say that people weren't in favor of, because who doesn't want a $500 check before Christmas?
Well, absolutely, and we'll get into the details as we sort of do a better assessment of what went well and what didn't go so well for both the opposition and the government this session. But I would like to say that I think this is working for government and it is working for Scott Moe. And I base that on the most recent quarterly Angus Reid survey, where once again, Scott Moe is second in the nation at 56% approval rating, just slightly behind Legault in Quebec, well ahead of a whole bunch of other conservative premiers like Daniel Smith, like Doug Ford, like Blaine Higgs, like Heather Stephenson in Manitoba, who arguably have similar policies, particularly as it relates to maybe comparisons of the thrust of the Saskatchewan First Act versus the Alberta Sovereignty Act. Adam, what's working for Scott Moe and what's working consistently for the Sask Party government? I'm very curious as to what everybody thinks as to why he has maintained such a high rating, and he has ever since he's became leader in March, or sorry, in January 2018. He has maintained a very high rating, or a reasonably high rating, in these Angus Reid polls, except when he ran into a little bit of trouble a year ago related to mandates and masking mandates and vaccine mandates. Uh, what works for Scott Moe? Like it's got to be more than just the money of late because he was doing well before the money.
I think the Sask Party just in that particular poll, and when you look at even the election results and the voting, they just have a floor that they haven't been able to fall through, and much to the chagrin of the opposition and anyone else that's trying to make inroads and cut into that Sask Party popularity, that vote, he doesn't seem to drop below 50%. And even when he was kind of had lower numbers during the pandemic with, as you mentioned, some of the measures that came in, it's not clear whether people were opposing them for putting in more measures, or they were not a fan of the measures. That we didn't really quite get into uh, that minutia of that detail. So I think it's safe to say that even going back to Brad Wall, the Saskatchewan Party just seems to have 50% of people in that voting block in the Angus Reid poll, or 50% of people in Saskatchewan that are if they're following politics, they're just okay with how things are going. I don't think people necessarily blame the Sask Party for the affordability crisis. The Sask Party is definitely, and the government's cashing in right now due to outside forces, namely, the war in Ukraine, and they have admitted that. The finance minister has said as much, that these outside forces we can't control, but they're helping the commodity prices. They're helping the Saskatchewan government erase its deficit earlier than it had projected. So it's enabled them to give out money to people. It's enabled them to pay down the debt. It's enabled them to, start looking at things that have been asked for. Donna Hartbauer mentioned, helping out with a one-time payment for inflationary pressures to education, for healthcare money, so they can retain and recruit more people to the province. And that's the auditor's report kind of highlighted that this week, and that's was kind of a sticker shock number. And even the health minister said, "Well, I'm not sure about those numbers, but." 2,200 hard to recruit positions in the next 5 years, 700 in 3 cities alone. That's really shocking about how much work the government needs to do and how hard it's going to be to get some of those people into those positions. But the reality of the situation right now is there aren't enough people that are disappointed with how things are going. The $500 checks will definitely help. And I found it interesting. I know we've talked about this in the past, but during that by-election, I talked to the Saskatchewan Party candidate, and he said that he was going door to door and people didn't know about the checks. So, once that gets out, you get your check in the mail, people aren't going to be batting an eye at it. And I know that we talked about, also at the Grey Cup launch, Scott Moe had a bit of a mixed reaction when he was introduced. And then someone pointed out, "Oh, you're getting $500 checks." And then a big cheer went up. So
Yay!
uh,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
people are going to remember that. And I think come election time in 2024, that's something that the NDP will not necessarily be able to criticize. And the government will be able to, I'm sure that'll be on the front of a lot of their campaign material.
Well, uh, Jeremy, I'll start with you because I found it fascinating this session because there were a lot of really low moments for the government this session. Yet, as Adam pointed out, there's also these things that worked really well for them. What did you see in terms of either opposition reaction, public reaction, or even the government's reaction that that were the low moments for the Sask Party government, and what did you see as sort of the high moments for them? Some of which I guess Adam described right now. Certainly that $500 check was because everybody loves it, and for good reason. Like I mean, it was well framed in terms of basically saying it's your resource money, you should be getting it back. It's a one time thing, and that had, I guess that would be one of my uh, suggestions as high moments. What did you see, Jeremy?
I think the biggest low moment was at the very beginning when convicted murderer Colin Thatcher came into the throne speech and was invited by Lyle Stewart. And that's when we really saw the government have to respond to something that maybe they didn't think was so serious at the beginning. And then obviously that caught up to them with the premier having to apologize 5 days later. So that was probably the lowest moment for the Sask party, I think. I think a lot of people can agree with that. I think it caught maybe both parties a little bit off guard in a way where we had Carla Beck wanting to come in to really talk about affordability and all these challenges she thought were really real issues that people were facing. But then you have Colin Thatcher come in, that same day and just kind of maybe sets the mood or sets the tone, right? And has to kind of take both parties off their message in that very beginning there.
Yeah.
Um,
And without
I,
interrupting your thought, I just want to tell
yeah,
people to read your story on this today, just because I love good rights in journalism. And this is such an excellent right that sort of summarized that just, I think, absolutely perfectly, Jeremy. But sorry, go ahead. So,
no,
what were the
yeah, no.
low?
The lows,
Yeah, the lows.
or for
Or
the
the
SAS party?
well, I guess we might as well sort of look at the lows for the NDP too while we're here right now, and then we'll.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think one of the lows for the NDP was the Saskatchewan First Act, and I think this is where the government actually had a bit of a win there. Um, and there's different reasons for that, right? Because when it came out, there was actually quite a bit of a muted response. We didn't see like this big blowback that we saw in Alberta, and that's probably a good thing for the government to have that not that much criticism on them for an act that I think a lot of people thought could go pretty extreme, but it just looks like it didn't do that. And where I think that was a low for the NDP is was when they voted yes during second reading, it just allowed the government to really frame the debate about around them wanting supporting this, and they took advantage of that. And I don't know if the NDP really saw it coming or things like that. I guess what they couldn't say was that the NDP supported Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau, because I think that's maybe what they wanted the NDP to fall into more. But at the end of the day, I think that was still more of a win for the government. I think one of the losses for the government, and I put this in the win category for the NDP, was the qualified independent Christian schools issue. Um, we've seen lots of allegations of emotional and physical abuse at these schools, and they go back to even 2013, which is not that long ago. And Matt Love, the education critic, kind of made this point that if you go to the government's website, you can see that schools don't always have to follow, public education practices. And he says the government needs to change legislation and regulations around this. And why I think this is an NDP win is because we've seen Education Minister Dustin Duncan say in the chamber, I'm speaking with schools now about this. I'm talking to them and seeing maybe if there's any changes we need to make to increase the oversight. So the NDP is getting a bit more movement on that issue, particularly. Now in health, one more. I think I think the NDP. I think they won on health this time, and the reason I say that is because our system is under so much strain. They brought in people having all these issues, and I think what put them over the edge in the win category was the auditor's report that Adam talked about. That just showed more than 2,000. We're going to be short more than 2,000 health workers over 5 years, and it just really laid clearly the situation we have in Saskatchewan and how the government's own plan might not be enough to fix this situation. So even though they are doing things, and Paul Merriman was in the Philippines, I think our healthcare system, according to the auditor and all these people in it, needs a little bit more care right now.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it for you, Adam. And Jeremy kind of reviewed a whole series of lows and highs for both sides of the legislature this session. And I guess I'd ask you the same question, but maybe with more the intent of what do you think is going to have the most lasting impact for lows and highs for the oppositions and the government in the coming year and such, and leading into the 2024 election? Because I guess that's where we're at right now.
I think the affordability issue stuff is not going to go away, and that's going to be something that I think Carla Beck has sort of made her brand since she was running as leader. So I don't see that as going away. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation we find ourselves in Saskatchewan and in Canada is the healthcare system is under enormous strain. There's stories about EMS not being available. There's stories about obviously we know this is well documented. Doctors not accepting patients, clinics closing down, service disruptions is what the government calls it, but there's whole communities that don't have healthcare services at the moment. And the auditor even saying that she was having a hard time getting information from the SHA as to where those health clinics that needed and hospitals that needed staffing, where they were. And so she said, if you don't point out where the problem is, you're not going to be able to fix it. Those things are going to be pressing needs, because that's something that affects everyone. It's not a partisan issue. It's not something you could say, oh, I don't support the government or I don't support the opposition, therefore I don't care about my health care. I think that's something that's just going to continue to bubble up. It's being played out in other provinces, and the government's going to have to get really creative on how they attack that. And those stories are going to continue, unfortunately, for the next little while.
And they can't be placated by Paul Merriman's trip and everything, like, because he comes back and he brings back some interesting numbers about how many people that will have, and maybe it solves the problem for a while, or maybe it looks like it gives the government the argument that it's doing something to solve what in essence is somewhat an unsolvable problem for all governments. But but I guess what I'm sort of interested in is what you're talking about is that sort of lasting impact uh, of 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 these issues that just don't seem to go away, and regardless of what governments and plural try to do in terms of addressing getting doctors in, getting nurses into these smaller communities, until there's some serious restructuring, I don't see any government basically having um, the solutions that won't make these power problems go away, as you suggested.
Yeah, I think the auditor kind of laid bare something and made it very helpful for the journalists in the room. I know Jeremy and I were in there. This is an independent person who looks at it with a clear eye and doesn't have a political bend either way. And she said this is the status quo isn't good enough. And even though the province is taking some positive steps, this is something the SHA should have been doing years ago. And the fact that they're just putting out a health and human resource plan now is not good. And and she was really stressing, and we asked the minister about this. He wanted to talk about the Philippines, but you have to keep the people you have, and then you have to find out why they're leaving. And she really nailed those 2 points, I think, repeatedly. And in my experience covering the legislature, it's never really the economy stories. It's rarely the education stories. The social service, the healthcare is the mega story always. It's the biggest chunk of money. It affects everyone. If you don't have kids in school, you are concerned about education perhaps, but everyone pays attention to, can I get in to see a doctor? Can I get my medication? Am I going to get my surgery? Um, can my kids get their
Yeah.
medication? We're
Can
seeing all
grandma and
these issues
grandpa,
right now.
nursing homes, yeah,
Nursing homes,
absolutely.
there's no continuing care aides. We're going to have a massive shortage on that. And this is something that the government can't kind of play off, I don't think, as well. We went to the Philippines and we're bringing back 150 people. That is good. But the auditor pointed out we need much more than this, and we need to get way more creative. And the opposition's even pointed out, BC's getting more creative with the doctor pay. They've kind of attempted to do that. We're not sure what Danielle Smith's plan is going to be in Alberta. So the government is that this is going to be the thing that hangs over them, the cloud that hangs over them. And it's been like that since, probably since COVID started. All we've talked about in the last 2 years is healthcare. And I think that's what we're going to be in store for the next year or so. As we see the impacts of COVID, it obviously has impacted people with leaving work, retiring early, leaving the profession due to burnout and stress. 66% of SHA workers saying they're burned out is an insanely high number. So I think that's just the thing that is going to be front and center going forward. As much as both parties want to talk about affordability or talk about the economy, it's always going to come back to healthcare. And that's always the people that come into the legislature. 8 out of 10 people that come into the legislature, it comes back to healthcare. It comes back to formula for your kid, medication, can't get a surgery, all these things that I think that always resonates with people. And I think that's something that's just going to stay. That's my crystal ball prediction. Not a bold one, but I
I
think that's what I see over in the next few
Go
months.
ahead, Jeremy. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to add something, and yeah, no, I agree with that for sure. I think also what to watch for is, I guess, resource prices. And I know you're saying the economy sometimes isn't the biggest thing, but if the war continues and we have all these high prices, that's just going to mean government's going to have a lot more money, and maybe going into the next election as well. And so that always kind of goes well for government when they have a lot of money to work with. And I guess that's where I also put a little bit of a win for the government was having their big surplus, because it just gives them a lot to use and a lot to do with kind of going forward.
It truly is. And with that money, they can actually practically apply it to what they're kind of doing right now, which is offering incentives for people to come here, foreign doctors in particular, or foreign nurses, and maybe move into more of a training realm. But I really think that what Adam is talking about has such important long term implications, because until we restructure in a way where you're going to get services to people, be they nurse practitioners, be they mental health services, be they just doctor and nurse services, to uh, somewhat of an easier access to the communities, we're going to have the same thing we saw last summer, which is ER closures and lab tech closures and everything else. And I don't, I guess as we wrap up, did either of you sense the session solved many of those problems?
No.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would just
It's tough
No,
to
I don't
solve.
think
Yeah, no.
so.
I was just going to add.
Yeah,
I think one of the things we're talking about wins and losses quickly, and something that just came up recently that I think we talked about the Saskatchewan First Act, but I think the fact that the AFN, Assembly of First Nations, FSIN, is speaking out so publicly and nationally about the Saskatchewan First Act and tying it to the Alberta Sovereignty Act, which is already going back to the drawing board. I think those that is something that is not a win for the government, even though this is their big bill. And it didn't come. The opposition didn't necessarily come from the NDP. I know the opposition talked about lack of consultation and that sort of thing, but this is the opposition they're getting from the outside to this. And so far they've said it's inclusive, it's going to include everyone, we're all benefiting from this, but that's not the way that those organizations see it, and I think that's something to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, it was fascinating that way. This is a great conversation, guys. Thanks so much. I think we probably need to wrap up about now. Probably go on a lot longer, like we normally can. Adam, Jeremy, thanks so much, and I hope to see you guys. Well, I will see you around the legislature and such, but I hope the rest of you will join us on Inside the Marble Palace in the near future.
Thanks guys, great work.
Thanks.
yeah, thank you.